forward to going through a real fun group of measurement tools and a few things actually I discovered yesterday brand new to show you. So I sat down yesterday. It always makes everyone else nervous in the office. And I said, what am I going to talk about today? And I came up with this list of things that seem to be pretty important when you are doing measurements. We're going to start with talking about calibration. That's absolutely the first thing we've got to do, but also understanding viewports on sheets, which can mess up your calibration. So it's important to be aware of those. I'm going to go through some of the basic measurement tools, the differences between a couple of them, but not going to really beat them to death, but just to show you how those work. A really wonderful new feature in the 2019 release having to do with individual unit settings per markup. It's just fabulous. And if those of you that used to jump through mathematical hoops to convert square feet to square yards or cubic feet to cubic yards, you don't have to do that anymore. There was actually this really cool thing with a cutout and being able to convert that using a fill to an area or volume. I'll show you how that works. I didn't even know that was in there. I'll show you the dynamic fill tool. It's a really nice tool that I really have mixed feelings about. Markup tools in tool sets absolutely have to use tool sets. I'm going to look at the markup list and a lot of custom columns I created to show you how those work, and then basically saving those all to a profile. So without further ado, let me just get into a document here. Okay. I happen to be in currently the Revu Advanced profile. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Takeoff profile or other profiles that you can create. And I'm going to be really just working on 2 sheets in this very large set. So there's 33 sheets in here, but what I did is I created 2 bookmarks so I can kind of sneak back and forth between page 4 and page 28. And if you don't know what bookmarks are, we covered all of that in the last webinar, and that's all been posted. So take a look at that online. And the measurement tools are going to be available in this panel over here on the right-hand side. We also have our measurement tools in a toolbar up here at the top. And then, of course, from the tools pull down, you have measure, and then we have all of those. So let's start out with calibration. Typically, your files will have previously been scaled. They may not be scaled correctly, but you should see that down here on the bottom on the status bar. By the way, if you don't see these 2 bars at the bottom of the screen, the navigation bar and the status bar, those can be turned on, I believe, from the, there is a menu. I usually use F4 and F8, but there are, oh, here it is, toolbars, the status bar and the navigation bar on the tools pull down. So F4 and F8. By default, I believe the navigation bar is turned off. I have no idea why, or maybe that's the status bar. You should have both of those turned on. Okay, but calibration really basically says how far is it from point A to point B, right? So 23 feet, 10.5 inches is what that says, but this is not plotted at full size, right? This is plotted to some kind of a scale. So what scale has this been plotted at? We need to calibrate that. There is a really cool new tool in this release that if down here on the bottom where I just showed you the scale, if that way down here says no scale or no current scale, I forget exactly the phrase, then when you start to actually do your measurements, it will stop you and ask you to calibrate before that, and before it actually gives you any measurements. The other thing is that in this particular release, you'll notice on the thumbnails that you can actually see the scale for the sheet, the overall scale for the sheet. That's a new feature in this as well from the dropdown that says page scale. Okay, so let's look at calibration. Now, just before I do that, I'm going to introduce the concept of viewports, because if you are calibrating within a viewport that is already calibrated, you're wasting your time. So you'll notice over here on the measurement toolbar or the measurement panel rather. Down here at the bottom, we have viewports. Depending on the software that you are using and depending on the PDF driver that you're using, you may end up with a lot of viewports that are unnamed. And if you've ever run into this, what will happen is when you open your file for the first time, it'll say, there are unnamed viewports in this document. Do you want to delete them? The answer to that is yes, because it's much more difficult to figure out all of these unnamed viewports and what they are and scaling them and all of that versus recreating them. So I'm going to recreate one on sheet 28 for you to show you how that works. If they come through with names like this, then the odds are the scale may have come through as well. So if I left click on the first floor plan south view part, you see all of that on there. And then when I click on general notes, you see that viewport. So these viewports actually come through from the CAD or BIM program that were views either in a layout or on a sheet. And on this particular file, they aren't, on this particular sheet, they're not really of much value. But if I sneak over to page 28 and show you those, you see those are actually pretty valuable. I went ahead and deleted the large one, and I'm going to recreate that in a minute for you. But I'm going to go ahead on this page, page 4, and delete them because they're really not needed. So the way I can delete that is I can select it and then just below that pick the X, right? Not a big deal. Okay, so now I have no viewports. Therefore, when I start doing calibration in here, it will actually be measuring not within that viewport, but within the sheet itself. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can calibrate. The first thing is that you can use a preset value, right? So you can preset and say, well, let me see what this sheet is set to. This sheet is supposed to be 1/8 inch equals a foot. So I can say, well, I'll go to this drop down and I'll set it to an 1/8 inch equals a foot, right? Okay, so now I'm set to 1/8 inch equals a foot. Let's see what I get when I measure from, let's see what I get when I measure from point A to point B, right? So I get 5'7". So that worked out well. Maybe there isn't a scale, or maybe you don't know what the scale is, or maybe you're concerned that when you did measure that, it didn't quite give you exactly what you thought. So maybe at that point, it really is important to use a custom scale. So if I click over on custom, what I'm going to do is actually click on the calibrate tool. You'll get this a calibrate button. You'll get this message. I'll pick OK to that. And it'll ask me to pick 2 points. I'll pick that point and that point. By the way, I'm able to snap to content because down here at the bottom of the screen, I have the snap to content turned on. Okay, so it says, well, that's a certain distance. What is that distance actually representing? So I'm going to say that it is representing 23 and then the foot mark dash 10.5 and then the inch mark. Press enter and there is the custom calibration. So again, now if I come over to measure something, let's try the 6'5". That came out 6'5 1/4". So maybe there's something odd going on there, right? So you have to, again, I would double check these. Maybe this really isn't plotted 100% to scale. And so what I'm measuring, maybe that what it's actually reading out there is not the actual value. So that could have been something corrected as well. So you kind of have to play with these different things. Again, with certain CAD programs, the numbers can be adjusted. I'm going to go back. The presets seem to actually work pretty well here. So let me go back and go with my 1/8 inch equals a foot and try that measurement there. Sometimes one works better than the other. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to stick with the preset. But if the preset wasn't working, then you can do the calibration and pick a distance and then tell it what that is. Okay, so important to do calibration, but what if we have a sheet in our set that has multiple scales, right? So 1/8 inch, 1/8 inch, 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch, and then down here at the bottom, 1/16 inch. Well, so we are going to create these different viewports. So you'll notice as I click on the viewports over here on the right-hand side of the screen, we get a scale. So we get 1 inch equals 8 feet, 1 inch, 1 inch equals 8 feet, 1 inch equals 8 feet, 1 inch equals 4 feet, right? So how do I create an overall plan for the finished plan? Well, all I have to do is come over underneath the list of viewports and click the plus. And it says select a region to create a viewport. So I will hold down my left button and drag a boundary. And I will set this scale as 1 inch equals 16 feet. My eyesight worked, I'd be dangerous. I can set my precision for measuring and I can give it a name. So I will call it the finish plan and pick OK, apply. So now I have that. So why is this important? Well, you'll notice I'm in a view. This view here, whoops, this view here is going to be at 1/16 inch. This view is going to be at 1/8. This view is going to be at 1/4. So I'm going to use the length measurement tool and draw something a couple of inches long. So there's 44 feet, 7 inches. I'll come up into the enlarged floor plan, draw something about the same length. And I'll come into the even larger one, draw something about the same length. So you'll notice that as I dimension in each of these, it reads the calibrated scale. Even more interestingly is if I take this, notice this says 44 feet 7. If I take this and drag that into that view, it rescales itself. So when you're doing these measurements, it's super critical to be working with the proper scale in the proper viewport, okay? I won't beat that to death, but that is really super important. So basic measurement, the next step I had was basic measurement markup tools in Revu. Let me go back to my page 4. So I've already created a few in here. I've created some custom things. I've created some areas. I created some linear measurements. I created some counts. And so we'll take a look at those. The area is probably the one that would be kind of used the most if you're doing those kinds of two-dimensional takeoffs in plan. The other thing you can do with areas is you can give a wall height so that you can not only get an area, but you can also get the heights of the walls in that particular room. The area tool in the toolbar over here in the panel, you have, I'm in the cutouts. I don't want to do polygonal cutout. I want to do areas. So let me see if I expand that a little bit. I'm simply getting cutouts there. Okay, so I'm not seeing the area. We'll go to where I can see it, which is up here at the top, which is this tool right here. So the area tool, when I click on that, real basic form, if it is a rectangle, just hold down my left button and drag. Hold down my left button and drag, right? So pretty straightforward. If you have a more complex shape that you want to outline, you would simply left click and drag around left click. And I'll just kind of go around the edges of this shape inside here, this sort of shaft. When you get to the last point, you can either left click and then press enter or double left click and you will get your area. Now, you'll notice that it kind of snuck that that information kind of into an awkward spot. You can always hold down the Shift key and move that text, apparently except for angles and radiuses and diameters. I'm sort of waiting to hear back from the Bluebeam tech people on that, but I think the answer is going to be no. So that's in its really basic form, right? So you can very easily do those kinds of area. You can go ahead and do two other kinds of linear measurements. I'm going to just delete that one out. You can do two kinds of linear measurements. One is a poly length and one is a perimeter. So they look awfully similar to each other. If I pick poly length and pick spots on the screen and then double left click to end, I will get information. If I use the perimeter and do something very, oops, that wasn't a very good sequencing. And my left mouse button is just really anxious. So let me just come down. Right? So similar. Now, the slight difference between the two could be that in this particular one, if I go to its properties and the properties panel, that we have segments turned off. So right here, we have segments turned off. If I turn on segments, I will see those. Or if I came back to the properties for the perimeter and select that, again, I can turn off the show segment values. So why use one or the other? Well, the poly length one was introduced so that you could have something in there. Let me go back to the measure panel called rise drop. So there's rise drop for the perimeter measurement, right? So this particular item would have that. If I go to the poly length, the poly length tool has the rise drop. So watch what happens when I click the perimeter tool. So that goes away. So if you need a rise drop value for piping or ductwork or whatever it is that you want to measure, there is a slight difference between the two of those. Okay, so I'm going to delete that and just delete that. Now, I've got a couple of different measurements here. One is in square feet. The other is in square feet. Now, in the past, when you were working in previous releases, the value that was being used, right? The value that was being used would be set for really all of these. So if I were to change square feet to square yards, it would have affected all of my measurements. In this particular release, I can go ahead and click on a boundary for an area, and up here at the top in the properties bar, I can go ahead and use my units dropdown and change the area to something else. So if this was carpeting, it can now be square yards, right? And it will affect only that particular item. That's really, really extraordinarily useful, especially when we come down here in a little bit and look up the markup list, where I've created a whole bunch of custom columns, which I will go through, and been able to separate costs per square foot versus cost per square yard, right? And I don't have to do any funky math like I used to in previous releases. Now, you may want to go ahead through and make changes to these. So the absolute most important thing with any markup tool that you put in is going to be in its properties, and it is going to be the subject, right? So the subject here is really, really important. You can set the subject there. You can set it up on the upper left of the properties bar from the drop down. You can set the subject there or in your markup list at the bottom of the screen. And the reason the subject is important is that you are going to use that for sorting, right? Or for your takeoffs. So something called area measurement square yards or something called area measurement square feet is really useless. What you really want is it to say carpeting or ceramic tile or concrete or something of that sort, right? You don't want it just to say area or text or count. So it's very important to change that, right? So we might go ahead and change this to something. I might just call this painted concrete, for example. So with painted concrete, I could also add that as the label, right? So I could also say painted concrete. And now that will show up in the text. Maybe beyond that, I would like to do something else. So maybe I would like to change the color of the border. So maybe the border, I'd like to be some kind of a dark blue color. Maybe I would like there to be some kind of a fill pattern in there. Oh, that's a fill color. Maybe I would like to have a fill pattern in there, right? Of some sort. I'm not sure what, but maybe I'd like to have a weave pattern. Maybe I don't really want it that dense, right? So I can, oh, that's the size. Maybe I don't want it quite that dense. So let me lighten that up a little bit, right? So I can do something like that, right? I don't want to do that over and over and over again. So when I want to save something like painted concrete, and I really don't want square yards, I really want to change that to square feet. So I'll go ahead and change that back. At least I don't think I want square yards for that. I'll go back to my units for that, and I'll change that back to square feet. Oop, that's cubic. Let's go back here, square feet. Right. So now what I want to do is over here on my left in my tool sets, we went through that a couple of other webinars ago. I am going to save this into a tool set that I have called My Tools, Reid's Tools, right? So I can save that by right-clicking on that, coming down and saying add to tool chest, add it to Reid's Tools. So now here at the bottom, I have painted concrete. Right? So if I wanted to do some more painted concrete, let me go ahead and get rid of this. If I wanted to do some more painted concrete, maybe these two rooms here, get painted concrete. I'm going to double left click to change it over to dynamic, drag my shape, come over here, drag my shape. Okay. And I now have painted concrete listed. Why is that important? Well, that's going to become important down here again in the markup list, because now I will have carpeting, ceramic tile, concrete columns, conduit, lavatory, and painted concrete, right? Okay, so it's pretty important to set up your tool correctly, or your markup tool correctly, and then to use it efficiently to save it into a tool set. Okay. Some of the other tools beyond area and the perimeter and poly length, there's radius for, there's diameter and radius tools. There's a volume tool, a count tool, and some cutouts. I wanted to show you the cutout tool, actually. I'll show you the others. The others are just pretty straightforward. The general measurement tool is pretty easy. The angle tool, pretty straightforward, although not extraordinarily flexible. If I click on the angle tool, basically I pick 3 points with the center vertex establishing the angle. What I'm still searching for is a way to relocate that text besides the way you can by using the shift key for areas. Doesn't seem to be a way to do that for angles. The other two pretty straightforward ones, radius. Again, there's actually two. There's a 3-point radius and then just picking the center and then dragging for a radius. So that one is pretty basic. The same thing for diameter, picking 2 points and establishing a diameter. Okay. Volume, if you were doing volume, let's say I have this concrete column, let's say it's 10 feet tall. I can click on the volume tool Again, hold down my left button, drag, set the depth of the column here in the panel, set that to 10 feet, right? And then again, I'd be changing the units from cubic feet to cubic yards, okay? So pretty straightforward there. I'm gonna get rid of that. The count tool, it can be used simply to select things. So perhaps I have a bunch of urinals or chairs or something like that. I can go ahead and do a count on those just by clicking on those and then escape at the end. You also can resume, right? So I can right click on a count check mark and I can always resume the count. There's ways to split the count. Again, in your markup list, it's going to be important. I now have a count measurement, but that may not be exactly what I want it to say. So I would right click. I would use the rename. See if I can find my rename. Try that again. Not going to give me my rename. I'll just go ahead and double click on it and just call those urinals. Right. So I now have a count of those, right? So those are the basic tools that I would be using. Okay. So let me show you this one really neat one that I discovered yesterday. So you may have a situation where you're defining an area and there are some columns in there. So I'm going to define, I'm just going to go click on the area tool and I'm just going to drag a boundary. And so there's my area. And just for fun, I'll add a little bit of fill color so we can see what's going on. And I'll reduce the density of that. Okay, so 763.88 square feet, right? Now I have these two columns in here. So I'm going to use the drop down under area. And there's my polygon cutout. And I'll go ahead and hold down my left button and drag. Now watch that number, right? See how that reduced? And watch that number. See how that reduced? Okay. So now I have this. And now I need to get my concrete columns in here, right? So I could come back over here into my tool set, and I have one here called concrete column that I could use and place those in there or draw them in there. But I discovered something that is really cool with a cutout yesterday. So in what I would call draw mode or dynamic mode, and how do you switch from one to the other? Well, when you are in draw or dynamic mode, you can draw any shape you want. If you're in properties or what I call static mode, I'm going to double left click on the icon. It comes in its original shape, right? So what I want to do is start by making sure that I'm in that draw or dynamic mode, right? But I'm not going to actually draw, right? Watch what happens. Watch what happens as I move my cursor into where that column is. I said, wow, I never saw that little fill can before. So all I have to do is left click and it goes ahead and fills that. Is that cool or what? I didn't even know that existed, and I've been using the software a long time. I think that was added in 2017, but I can't be sure it wasn't there before that. So if it doesn't work if it's not an area, right? So I tried it with just drawing a rectangle. It doesn't work. It has to be an area, and it has to be a cutout within the area. And then the tool, if you're set in draw or dynamic, I call it mode, right? So you can draw any shape you want. When you go into one of those cutouts, it automatically becomes this fill. Okay, so that's one I didn't know as of yesterday. Hopefully you didn't know that as well. If you did, it's like, that's not a big deal. Reid doesn't know everything. I'm gonna go ahead and delete that, delete that, delete that. Okay, time for some more water. Dynamic fill, that is sort of a version of dynamic fill, but dynamic fill is really for more complex shapes like this, right? So without dynamic fill, let me just kind of go through and draw an area kind of crudely here. I would have to, that was very crude, I would have to kind of click around this, right, in order to kind of establish a certain shape, which is not going to be very accurate to the shape of the ramp. Just to see that, I'll go ahead and put some fill in there again, and I'll lighten that up a little bit. So how would we get this to the right shape? Well, we'd have to come through, put our cursor over the edge of the boundary and right click and convert that to an arc. And with that converted to an arc, I can kind of drag the handles on this into a more accurate shape, right? Now, sometimes it gets a little persnickety. If you hold down the Shift key, it'll give you a little more flexibility, right? And you'd have to go ahead and do that all the way around. It works, takes time. Okay, so what else could we do? Well, we do have something called dynamic fill. The dynamic fill tool is kind of hiding, if you use the drop down over here on the upper right, it's hiding, there it is, there's dynamic fill. It's also up here under dynamic fill and under tools, dynamic fill under measure, right? It's the last one. So dynamic fill creates this whole toolbar that gets added. And the first thing you need to do is make sure that your space edges, or what you're trying to do dynamic fill on, is closed, which it is. So I don't have to draw, but I could draw boundary edges. I'm going to use the settings here to basically reduce the line thickness. Now it only goes down to 25%, which isn't thin enough for me, but that's a separate issue. I can adjust my fill size and fill speed. Don't pick close at this point or the whole box closes, just click on the same settings tool. And now I click on that fill paint can, and holding down my left button, I'm going to start to kind of spray paint in here. And I let up a little bit, spray paint some more. And looks like I have a couple of corners here, see if I can do those. One more there. Okay. Now, the most important thing is, what do you want this to be? So I want this to be an area. So up here at the top, I left click area. So that's highlighted. And I go ahead and pick apply. And I pick close. And now I have my area, right? 851 square feet. Then if I put fill on, we'll see that it does a pretty good job. There are some issues with line width and things of that sort, especially when you get to door openings, because you're drawing 25%. What actually happens, I'll exaggerate it, is it'll come along, it'll hit that 25%, jump up, jump back down, and come across, right? Because it's reading the thickness of the line. You can come back through and remove those points if you want. It's really just a matter of how complex the shape is versus how many extra points there are. Perhaps it's just easier to draw it in the first place. But in this case, the dynamic fill gave me a really good value there. There's also a tool, if I can find where my painted concrete is. Here's my painted concrete. I think I can go ahead and use my brush up here. See if I can find my brush for matching. Looks like I'm going to go ahead and select that painted concrete. And now I can use my match paintbrush and click on that dynamic fill. And you'll see that we added that. The one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't change the name, right, or doesn't add that text to it. So again, if I were to look at that, whoops, if I click on that, it will still call it area measurement. So somehow the label doesn't carry through with that format painter. So yeah, not necessarily the most valuable tool in the world, but you now have dynamic fills. You can see how that works. Okay, so let's take a look at our markup list. Down here in the markup list, notice that I've got some carpeting. I have ceramic tile, concrete columns, lavatory count, conduit, painted concrete, urinals, right? So I have these a column called units that's built in, page index, area, volume, length, count. All of those are built in. What I did was create all of these custom columns here, okay? So to create custom columns, I'll just show you one of them, pretty straightforward. Drop down markup list, columns, the last item, manage columns. At the top, we have custom columns, and here are all the columns that I created. Last time I went through in the last webinar on managing your documents, talked a bit about choice options, but I want to show you numbers and formulas. So just starting with cost per square foot, it's basically a number based on currency, 0 places included in totals, right? And I did the same thing for cost per square yard. Same thing for cost per cubic yard, cost per linear foot, and cost per item, right? So these are all just basic numbers. Then we need formulas. So we get to total cost per square foot. And here, the drop-down underneath the title is a formula. And what you do is you simply come into the expression and you key in a letter, right? We do times and then a letter, right? So I have a function, multiply, divide, add, subtract, or some other functions, and then just put a letter in. And here are all, right, so these are your functions. Here are all of the different variables that I can use, right? I'm not actually wanting to add any more to it, but that's how you create these expressions. So I created an expression to create cost per square foot, area times cost per square foot. For cost per square yard, in the past, I had to do, oh man, I had how many square feet to square yard? Is it 27? Do I divide by 27? Do I multiply, right? And you had to sort of figure that all out. You don't have to do that now because you can have this separate value, right? And I can simply take area and multiply it by cost per square yard. And the area has already been adjusted by changing the unit value for that particular markup. The final one is total project cost, and that one is simply adding all of the total costs together. Now, I created this one column here also called dummy. You're gonna say, well, why do I need a dummy column? Well, the reason I need that, oh, let me add some numbers here. So I added some painted concrete, there's square footage. I have no idea what cost per square foot for painted concrete should be, but I'll put in, well, I don't know, $8, right? And I'll click there, put in $8. Now, if you would put that value in first, so if you would put that value in first, when you go ahead and do a save to a tool set, that cost will be filled in as the default. So if that's your default, that's great. And if I come across, I can see my total square footage cost for that, right? Those are my prices there. There's my urinals. I'm going to say my cost per item for a urinal is, I don't know, $195. It's probably cheap. That was way too expensive. Let's try that again. $195. Those are very expensive. Those are the gold urinals at the location of some very wealthy people. So there we have $195. Those are going to get multiplied by 4, and then we'll get total item cost, right? So you'll notice that after all of these take place, right? All of these different columns take place. I have a total project cost, and yet, right, I don't see a total project cost. The problem is how you're sorting, right? So everything is being sorted a little differently. And so there isn't an easy way to get a total unless you have a column that is identical for all the items. Well, that is why I created this dummy column. So my dummy column is just that. It's just a column that I can keep empty. And now if I click on sort by dummy column, if I left click on dummy, I have my total project cost. It's at the top, right? So there are 12 items that all have nothing for dummy, and that's the total. So that's kind of a cool little trick. Of course, if you are much better than I am using Excel software, you can always use the drop down here and do a CSV summary. Inside of here, you can choose which columns you want to export, right? Which of these columns do I want to export? How do I want to filter? What's my output going to be? Is there an existing file? Do I want to overwrite it? Append, a whole bunch of other things in there. And I just say, go ahead and pick OK. You could then massage it inside of Excel. The last thing I want to show you with about a minute or so left before we can do questions is the concept of profiles. So you'll notice that right now, the profile that I'm in is called advanced, but maybe if you're doing takeoffs, you may want to create one called quantity takeoff. Why do you want to set up a specific profile? Well, all of these custom columns that I have created down here at the bottom, all of these custom columns, if I go back to manage columns, you'll notice there's an option to save to profile, right? And if I decide to save this to a profile, let's say I'm in the quantity takeoff profile, all of these custom columns that I have created will be saved into that profile. So when I switch into that profile before starting my estimations, it will pull in all of these columns to all of the files that I open and not just the one that I'm in. So the value of having a profile is that you've gone through all of this work down here. Why not leverage that into a profile? If you're not doing takeoffs, if you're doing markups or you know, field issues or something like that, maybe you don't need all of this stuff added to each file. But if you are doing takeoffs, maybe you do.